Hi everyone and welcome to the channel. In today's video we're going to talk about how long ball pythons live and why. Now obviously that sounds like a really simple question, so rather than make you wait for the whole video to learn the answer, I'm just going to say outright a ball python has easily the capacity to live 20 years or longer in captivity. That is not an exceptional lifespan, and if your ball python lives less than, say, I'm going to say at least 15, 16 years old, that would be considered quite unusual. So they are a very long-lived species. They are capable of living an extremely long time, and that is kind of like the basic average lifespan I'm giving you there. I mean, probably it is an exceptional case. There was one ball python I know lived to at least 62 years old, and I think that was in the St. Louis Zoo. And again, that's exceptional. That was probably a snake which was in some way very slightly genetically different to its conspecifics or other average ball pythons. But it is a possibility. So yes, your ball python should really live a good, minimum 15 years, easily 20, quite possibly 30 and maybe 40. It's all possible. So for example, I've got Bobby here helping me in today's video. He is the oldest snake I have, and he's going to turn 15 probably, I think, around August. And the only thing that's changed with Bobby since he's gotten a little bit older, he's kind of like not really a middle-aged, but an older adult ball python now. The only thing that's changed with him is that he has got just incredibly docile. He's got a bit more lazy, and he has a tendency to gain weight more easily. So right now I have to feed him every 2 to 3 weeks at the moment. He's put on a little bit of chub around the sides, but other than that, his health has been great the whole way through. He's had a couple of minor bumps, which I'll talk to you about probably later in this video if I get the time. But he's never had any kind of disease or illness, and there is a reason for that. So when we talk about longevity in ball pythons, and just like we talk about lots of aspects of their care, there's this tendency for people to relate everything to scientific studies, to try to make everything a bit more, sciencey, trying to merge the scientific domain with the social media domain and translate any small observational study to facts that will help you learn to look after your snake. And that's, in the Western countries, that's mostly a result of hyper-credentialism, as I call it, or some people just say credentialism, but the idea that anything coming from a BSc is golden, it's not really always the case, and I say that as someone who works with data and who studied science for a good 7 years. So what I want to do with this video is explain to you the other factors that help ball pythons live a long time in captivity, the 5 main factors that you need to pay attention to, and I want to get away from making everything too complicated and encourage you to think of your snake's health as a balance, as an equilibrium. You have a healthy snake here, which is getting everything he needs, his environment's correct. On the other hand, if you have one factor which is very out of whack, or several factors that are slightly out of whack, be it temperature, humidity, hygiene, etc., it will tip the balance, and your snake will tip into poor health. And when that happens, it will get one of the most common diseases that causes death in captive ball pythons. Usually it's an RI, respiratory infection, or scale rot. Occasionally it's chronic shedding issues, or anorexia, but just not feeding. And those are the most common things, the group of common ailments that befall pet ball pythons when some of these factors are out of whack and your snake tips into poor health. So all I want to do in this video is just tell you about the factors that will keep your snake healthy and kind of give a simple rundown of them so that you know, just off the top of your head, if these things are right, my snake's going to live 20, 30, maybe even 40 years. So before I get too far into it, I'm hoping Bobby's going to stay chilled out for the whole video. He is extremely chilled out these days, but all the snakes hate this bright light I'm using for the videos. But anyway, he seems happy right now, so let's get straight into it. Number one is temperature. Now, we talk a lot about, well, I'm going to talk a lot about hygiene and safety and stuff like that in a minute, but temperature is a factor that is not always talked about in entirely the correct context. It kind of is. We often hear about how temperature will help your snake to remain active and help him or her to digest their food, regulate their behaviors, etc. You know that they are poikilothermic ectotherms, so they are essentially cold-blooded, even though a lot of people don't like that term anymore, and they move around to regulate their body temperature. So they relieve temperature stress or cold stress by moving to a more comfortable area. And that is good to understand, all that stuff. You need to understand that because your snake needs to be comfortable to be happy. Stress is a factor in disease. But more to the point, because they are ectothermic, the most important thing to understand with temperature is that temperature fuels their immune system. Their immune system is unable to function correctly if they aren't warm enough. So if you have a ball python that is chronically cold, it will get sick sooner rather than later. Most commonly what happens if your ball python is too cold is it will get a respiratory infection. This is really common in private collections in countries like the UK, Canada, New England, in the US. A lot of people have trouble keeping their vivarium warm enough in the winter and the snake will get a respiratory infection. There's actually even a reasonably well-known zoo which often gets our eyes in the winter here in the UK, which I'm probably not supposed to know that, but I haven't named them, so it's okay. But yeah, that is basically how the main way that temperature is actually going to affect the lifespan of your snake. Because if it is too low, it will get an infection of some kind. It makes it more susceptible to disease because the immune system just doesn't have the energy to fuel the processes that it uses to fight disease, be it fungi, bacteria, viral pathogens, whatever. So that's pretty simple to understand. What I would say at this point is if you think you have the correct temperature in your setup, that's great. Hopefully you do, but my motto is double check everything. If you have an infrared thermometer gun, that will give you a correct temperature of the basking area or the warm spot or wherever your snake is. What I do in addition to this though is I get a digital thermometer probe and I place that under the snake's warm hide, under the substrate, so that I know the temperature with the snake sitting on it. And this is particularly good if you've got a tub set up, you've got the heat pad underneath, the thermostat probe underneath, but have a digital probe inside on top of the heat mat. That is a great way to, just even take away a step. It doesn't give you the precise temperature because your snake can make it a bit cooler by sitting on it, for example, but it immediately alerts you if there's a big fluctuation in temperature that you need to know about without you having to go into the enclosure with the thermometer gun and double check. So if you walk into the room and your digital thermometer is reading 105 instead of 89 or whatever it should be, there's a problem. Likewise, if it's only reading 60 when you go into the room in the evening, there is a problem. And that is just the best way to double check your temperatures effortlessly. Second, and this is a big one these days, is hygiene. So hygiene, I don't want to incur the anger of the bioactive setup people, but I would say that scale rot in particular has made a massive comeback in the last few years. I'm seeing people with ball pythons with scale rot on Facebook forums all the time, and it is very often with bioactive setups. And there's a bit of a misunderstanding with this because people seem to believe that you can have a bioactive setup with a snake that can do, 100, 150 gram turd on some occasions, and you can just leave it in there and it won't accumulate germs because the springtails and isopods will eat it and it's all fine. You just bury it in the substrate. And really this belief, it doesn't add up to the reality of the thing. This belief came around because of good marketing. With small animals, say dart frogs for example, which do tiny turds, the springtails and isopods will absolutely take care of them quickly. With a large animal like this, like a ball python, it's going to have time to slither around in the turd, paint the enclosure with it, and it's all over the substrate, plants, walls, etc. I've seen them do this on occasion. And if the cleanup crew, the isopods and springtails, do eat it, yeah, they'll get rid of most of the turds eventually, but there's no concrete proof that they get rid of protozoa or bacteria, for example, that stay stuck to the leaves of plants and their ornaments and other objects. So that is really something to think about. The hygiene is key. If you have a bioactive setup, I don't have anything against bioactive setups, by the way, but just spot clean it. That's all you need to do. When they do, make a big mess in there, you just spot clean it and remove it, and your bioactive setup, it will work okay. But it's not strictly honest to say that you can have a bioactive setup and never do spot cleaning when you have a larger animal, like a larger snake. Second, what I would like to say about hygiene is, like I've said, changing substrate is the best way to maintain hygiene. I change the substrate in my enclosures weekly, and I disinfect with F10 disinfectant, which is a veterinary disinfectant. So if you can't get that in the US, you can search for similar veterinary disinfectants online, and you will find something that is, vet assured safe, basically. But also another point I want to bring up with hygiene is one of the main kind of centers of disease, aside from when they make a mess in their enclosure, will be their water bowl. If you imagine that their water is sitting at 80 something degrees 24 hours a day, it is a nest for bacteria. So I'm just going to show you a short video in a second of me cleaning a water bowl, and I always recommend water bowls with smooth surfaces which aren't rough, because that reduces the surface area to volume ratio, and that reduces the surfaces that the bacteria can cling to. And when you clean your water bowls, make sure you scrunch your fingers around the bowl if they're ceramic, for example, so you get that nice scrunching noise, and you've got no sliminess, because the slime is bacteria and what we call biofilm, which is dead bacteria and their byproducts, their waste products. So that is a really important step to stop your snakes getting disease. Doesn't matter what kind of setup you use, pay extra attention to water bowls. And that is another factor which will help your snake's immune system essentially have less work to do and help your snake live longer, because it's less likely to get sick. Now we're getting into it, you're probably starting to see how these factors add up. Third on the list is safety, and as I said, Bobby actually had a little bump years ago, had to go to the vet, get antibiotics, etc, etc. The vet couldn't figure out what it was, I couldn't figure out what it was, and what it was a bump on either side of his jaw along the underside of the mandible, or the jawbone. We thought maybe it was some kind of infection, maybe it was a broken or ingrown tooth. It turned out I had put Bobby in a setup with a slight lip around the underside of the lid, and he was able to get his nose into there and push at it to try and get out when he was hungry. And I think there was females in the room as well, so maybe I should have had him in a separate room to the females. He obviously wanted to get to them. But essentially what he did was he got in there, he pushed on it, rubbed his jaw on it, and gave himself a swelling on either side. And this was, entirely my fault. He wasn't severely ill, but this could have turned into an infection if I hadn't noticed it and I hadn't changed his setup. That could have become an infection. That could have become, something eventually that could lead to stomatitis or, mouth rot or something like that if it got too serious and infected the bone, for example. So that is where safety comes in. Safety, when it isn't right, it's always, it's almost always our mistake. So likewise, you need to make sure that the setup doesn't have any holes your snake can poke its head into, any lips underneath the lid where it can cram its snout, for example. It can't have large wire mesh that your snake can rub its snout on, and it can't have rough or spiky ornaments, because ball pythons are heavy. They act quite slow moving, but they do come out at night and they'll try and escape all night, especially if they're male and there are females in the room. So, you know, safety is one that probably isn't talked about quite enough, but it is extremely important if you want your snake to live a long time. Because aside from that, Bobby's never had any problems. And like I say, the safety thing, that was only my fault. That wasn't anything, you know, genetically that he had wrong with him. It wasn't anything he had caught. It was purely something that I had missed. So this is always something to think about. Right, so after safety, I would say fourth on the list is diet. Again, diet is an important factor. I've not got a lot to say about this. There is, again, this is another topic where people wheel out various scientific studies which are, you know, more or less flawed in their contextual kind of understanding of the situation with actually feeding animals for a long time. So a lot of people say, you know, you could feed chicks or birds to ball pythons and they'll do just as well. And what I have seen with a lot of breeders and with my own personal experience feeding chicks and stuff like that and quails to ball pythons do tend to grow best on rats. They grow bigger, they grow heavier, and most of my males, you know, which are supposed to be much smaller, are actually Bobby's size at the very least, and they're all fed on rats. And statistically, if you look at the breakdown of the crude fat, protein, nutrient, calcium, phosphate, or phosphorus content of many birds, chicks for example in particular, proportionately it is similar to rats, and not that far off mice either. However, there is a big difference between something having the same amount of protein and the same kind of protein. There is a strong argument that if ball pythons do mainly rodents in the wild, which some people dispute, but most people do tend to agree with, hence their love of agricultural areas, there's strong reason to believe that from an evolutionary perspective, they probably have evolved to metabolize and use and digest rodent protein slightly differently and slightly better than other proteins. So this is probably why a lot of breeders tell me, well, I've tried chicks because they're so cheap, but when I switch them back to rats, they grow faster and they grow bigger. And that, you know, I tend to believe that, because this is just like, you know, it's all very well analysing things, but you do need to use critical thinking and context to understand the full picture. And I do tend to listen to experience as well. If a breeder has 15 years more experience than me, I'm probably going to listen to him. And this is just like if you go and ask anyone you know who does bodybuilding, ask them if eating chicken and eating steak is the same, and if it does the same for your body. I guarantee you 100% they'll say no, especially if they compete and they know what they're talking about. So as far as diet goes, get them healthy rodents from a local supplier that you trust, not from a big chain pet store. Get them from a supplier who is willing to talk to you on the phone or via Facebook or whatever about what diet they feed the rodents. If you give your snake healthy rodents that were fed a complete diet, those nutrients will be transferred to your snake because it's a complete food source, and that's what they're designed to eat. So it's really quite simple, but again, make sure you buy from a supplier who will willingly tell you what they feed their rodents, and you really can't go wrong with this one. Aside from the fact that you don't want to make your snakes too fat, which would happen if I let Bobby eat as much as he wanted to. He'd get obese and he'd get heart disease, for example. So that is worth remembering. Once they get to a certain age, they do have this propensity to get obese, and heart disease is very common in captive pythons. Like I said, Bobby is just getting to the edge of chubby now, so I'm going to keep him on his little diet for a while. Finally, last but not least, is humidity. Now, we all know that humidity, if it is too low, will cause stuck shed, stuck eye caps, which are things that in turn make your snake very uncomfortable. It can make your snake stop feeding from the stress, and it can lead to all kinds of issues, but it takes a while and it builds up. The most immediate danger with poor humidity is if your humidity is so high or so low that it can actually cause respiratory infections, or cause an increased chance of respiratory infections. And everyone knows that high humidity can give a snake scale rot in combination with very poor hygiene. But not a lot of people know that, yes, high humidity also gives some respiratory infections, but actually there's also strong evidence to suggest that a lot of reptiles will be more susceptible to respiratory infections from very low humidity as well. Essentially, we need to understand that any humidity range that is far too high or far too low is probably going to have an adverse effect on the mucous membranes in your snake's respiratory system and increase the chances of respiratory infections. So I would probably say actually that I actually keep my humidity slightly higher than most people. I keep it at about 65 for my snakes. And then when I see them going into shed, like getting the pink belly and going dark, that point is when I will up the humidity to 80% or so by spraying until they finish shedding. So I do keep reasonably high humidity for my snakes, and in combination with good hygiene, it works really well. So if you keep these 5 factors in check, keep them balanced, this will keep your snake's health balanced, and your snake can live a very, very long time. If you're my age, possibly long enough for you to pass it on to your children, which, it's also worth thinking about what a big commitment they are. If you keep them right, count on 20, 30 years. Anyway, as always, I'm glad Bobby's behaved for this video. But I hope you found this video informative. Please do like and subscribe, and please do also send me your comments, your questions, anything else you'd like to add. If you put that in the comments, other people will pick up on it and you'll help spread your knowledge as well, which I think would be exceptionally beneficial, rather than just have me using my knowledge, to have all of you join in as well. That'd be amazing. Thank you very much.